What's up, guys? Casino Crime doing another video for you today. Pretty excited because, hey, I like doing videos, but also because it's Christmas time. Um, you know, no matter what religion you are, this is a great time of year, and I want to wish everybody a happy holidays. And I also want to remind you that actually, this time of year really is the best time to grind. Doesn't matter if you're a live player or an online player. Where a lot of your easy profits come from is just grinding on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, New Year's Eve, New Year's Day. You're gonna get a lot of easy money. So go out there, sit at the tables, and watch the fireworks, as they say. I've had several different times over the last few years where at the end of the night, you're sitting on like 1,000 big blinds, or you just get these like epic people to go off at the table. So here's a reminder. It's a little bit of a sacrifice. You might have to either start playing early in the night and then go out later, or come home a little early to make sure you get the best hours. But overall, I would say that this is the time of year to really put in a little bit of volume if you have the time. Now, today's quote is from a guy named Brian Tracy. He's one of my idols, I should say. He's a staple, or has been a staple, in the self-development market. He focuses on productivity and stuff like that. And he's really old now, but he's still got really good material. And I like this quote from him today. It's, "Our goal is to constantly remind ourselves of who we want to be and the goals we want to achieve. And like a rocket ship gravitating towards a distant star, we will naturally attract ourselves there." Wow, powerful stuff. Reason I'm bringing this up today is, after reading some of his stuff and another book that I recommended to you guys called With Winning in Mind in one of the first videos, I wrote out a poker affirmation for myself. And I'm not going to read it because it's kind of long, but basically I made it a point to, every day remind myself of why I was playing poker and kind of what my overall goal was. I think a lot of people make the mistake in poker of, they set monetary goals, or maybe they even set hand volume goals. Well, hand volume goals are nice, and money's nice, of course, but I think that both of those are sort of like a byproduct of really enjoying playing poker and actually making correct decisions. A lot of times when people ask me what I do, I say that I'm a professional decision maker, right? The better that you become at making decisions in poker, the more money that you'll make and the more you'll enjoy it. I don't really look at it as gambling. I look at it as, I look at poker I look at it at its most basic level, right? Which is perfecting your ability to make decisions with incomplete information. So really, like, what I did was I wrote out an affirmation for myself, which says that I'm an excellent poker decision maker. And the more that you believe that you really are, what you're telling yourself, the better that you'll get at it. Most things, I think, I think that most skills, especially something like poker, comes from, your success in it comes from confidence. And any way that you can manifest confidence, is going to end up being good for you in the long run. So remember to, try not. A lot of poker players are a little bit self-deprecating. They like to beat up themselves and say, "Oh, I'm terrible. Oh, I always make this mistake. Oh, I always do this. I never win." And really beat themselves up. But it's important to stay positive, and it's important to remind yourself of what your goals are with poker, what your goals are in life, and what. Maybe poker's just a hobby for you, but no matter what it is, if it's important to you, you need to create goals and remind yourself how you're going to get there on a consistent basis and what it is at its most raw level. What we're going to do today is go over floating. We're going to go through some slides, as always, and then we are going to go over a couple of hand histories. So let's hop right into it. All right, so before we get into the situations that floating is good for, what exactly does floating mean anyway? Well, floating is often defined as calling a bet on one street with the intention of stealing the pot on a later street. Now, it's important to point out that floating can happen, on either the flop or the turn, but the discussion about floating during, these slides, it's going to be focused solely on flop play because, in other videos we'll cover, floating on the turn and stuff like that. But today I'm mostly going to talk about floating the turn. And floating the flop and stealing pots away on later streets is a strategy that many no-limit players are probably familiar with. And even if you haven't perfected it, there's a good chance that you've at least experimented with it a few times at the tables. But regardless of the floating strategies you found to be successful in either no limit or PLO, just realize for now that the profitability of a float comes from having the ability to bluff, semi-bluff, or value bet your hand on later streets. And in other words, floating in position provides you with a higher level of playability, as well as more opportunities on later streets to gain some profit that bluff raising or outright folding doesn't. And in fact, one of the biggest complaints I get from students goes something like this. Hey John, I totally suck at playing the turn, man. Whenever I c-bet the flop and get called by someone with position on me, I have no clue what to do when the draw gets there, or really any type of card that doesn't improve my hand to some degree. How the hell do I beat players who just call me every time I bet and make my life hell on later streets? Well, we're going to spend some time, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how to adjust to these players, but the main thing I want to point out is how difficult you can make it on players when you simply call in position and make them play 3 streets against you. And while we're on the topic, there's something I really want to point out before we go any further. The rest of this lesson, it focuses on a variety of floating strategies that you can use to make life difficult for your opponents. But that certainly doesn't mean that your options are limited to the topics covered here. Whenever you see an opponent do something that makes you uncomfortable, take note of it, steal it, and then use it on the other players. So for example, if it really tilts you when someone always floats you in position, then start doing it more against other opponents. It's one of the quickest ways to get better, and it's one of the reasons why I encourage players to look for some tough games to play in. So anyway, remember that, one of the reasons that position is so valuable in pot limit Omaha is because, it helps your ability to represent a wide range of hands. And, floating is one of the simplest techniques that you can use to accomplish this. So let's take a look at what kind of factors we need to consider to become a world-class floater, as well as make our out-of-position opponents hate us. First thing you need to know is that the vast majority of good floating opportunities happen in heads-up pots when we're in position. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you should float every time you find yourself with position in a heads-up pot. But if you're considering a float, what are the main factors you should be looking for? The first, and definitely the most important factor to consider, are the tendencies of your opponents. Ideally, the majority of your floats will be against weaker players, and there's also a few other flop tendencies to look for that are more specific than simply labeling a player as a weak player that we'll discuss in a moment. Next, board texture plays a key role in determining how profitably you can float. And under certain dynamics or against weaker opponents, you can make an argument for floating on almost any board texture. But in general, there's a few board textures that you should be floating on a high percentage of the time that we'll go over in the next couple slides. Last, the strength of your hand, as well as the number of turns and rivers that you can improve on, have a big impact on the type of line you should take post-flop. And as you'll see in a moment, it rarely makes sense to float with no equity in PLO. So now that we've defined the 3 factors we should be looking for, let's take a closer look at each one individually. Alright, previously we've talked about a variety of scenarios where understanding the tendencies of your opponents is crucial for making the best decision available, and floating is no exception. The first thing to look for is how often they're c-betting. And for what it's worth, this should definitely be one of the stats you want to have in your HUD. Generally, most players display the percentages for how often their opponents c-bet and fold the c-bets on their HUD, which makes sense because as far as stats go, it's a pretty reliable stat that offers valuable insight into how someone plays post-flop. But this is also a stat that depends on how big the sample size is that you have. Don't make the mistake of thinking a player is c-betting 100% of boards when you only have 25 hands on the guy. Now, I don't want to spend the entire time talking about c-betting HUD stats, but since we're on the topic already, I want to point out a few things. First, only paying attention to how often someone is c-betting can get you into a lot of trouble if you don't interpret the frequency correctly. Simply put, it's really important that you remember to take into account other pieces of information available in the hand about your opponents than, solely relying on the c-bet stat. I've mentioned previously that HUDs are an amazing tool if you know how to use them correctly, but they can also cost you a lot of money if you misinterpret the information given. So for example, most players' c-bet percentage is a lot higher in heads-up pots than it is in multi-way pots. And likewise, players' c-betting tendencies can vary a lot on different board textures. Some players c-bet dry boards much more than they c-bet wet boards, while other players might only be c-betting every hand against you because you've folded to every c-bet so far. So for example, a certain player might be c-betting, 85%, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to c-bet into 3 other players on a Jack 10-9 board without a very strong hand. But now I think you get what I'm trying to say. HUDs will never be a substitute for human observation, and you'll never get any better at poker if you rely on HUDs to play poker for you. Another tendency to keep an eye out for that should encourage you to float opponents lighter are the players that c-bet the flop and then check fold the turn with a high frequency. We love players like this because they make our lives easy by creating a bunch of dead money only to let us take it away on later streets. Put more simply, these are the guys you want to take a note on that says, doesn't barrel the turn light, or shuts down on later streets with air. Moreover, as I said in the first slide, forcing your opponents to bet twice and play later streets against you out of position definitely makes you much tougher to play against. And in general, anything you can do to make the other players at the table uncomfortable is definitely plus EV. Last, weak bets from weak opponents generally means, you guessed it, a weak hand. Depending on the board texture and your hand value, both of which we'll talk more about in a second, bluff raising might be the best option. But no matter what the line you choose, just make sure you don't let the fish off the hook with a weak flop c-bet. Make them earn it from you. You getting this stuff? All right, let's get to the next slide. As we've talked about previously, board texture plays a key role in defining what the optimal post-flop strategy is. And although I said earlier that you can make an argument for floating on almost any board texture under the right circumstances, there's generally a few board textures where floating is much more effective against a standard or unknown opponent. Now, floating on dynamic boards works well for a lot of reasons. And just in case you're in need of a reminder, saying that a board is dynamic simply means that the current nuts are likely to change by the river. See, we've mentioned several times before that one of the main benefits of being in position is having the ability to represent a wider range of hands, right? Well, floating on static boards can be difficult because the value of your hand is basically fixed onward from the flop. Whereas on dynamic boards, the goal is to basically just represent whatever it is they don't have. To put it in layman's terms, the range of value hands that we can credibly rep is much higher on dynamic boards than it is on static boards. There's few things that make an opponent more uncomfortable out of position than forcing them to bluff catch you on the turn and river when the nuts are constantly changing, which means that our main goal should be to force them to make a hand that beats us. I'm going to take you through a few hands here in a moment, but here's a few examples of the boards I'm talking about. 8-7 deuce two-tone, king 9-6 two-tone, and 10-5 deuce rainbow are all boards that players typically c-bet with a high frequency, but they can't take much heat without a strong hand on later streets when they're out of position. Now, this was touched on earlier, but one of the golden rules of floating in PLO is that barring some very opponent-specific reads, it's rarely plus EV to float without any equity. In No Limit, it's more common to see floats without any equity, because there's many more way ahead or way behind situations, post-flop. But regardless of what game you're playing, life is always better when you have some equity. Luckily for us, we're learning how to play PLO, which means that since the distribution of equities is much smoother than in other games, we're more often than not going to be flopping at least some small chunk of equity. But now you might be thinking, all right, Casino Crime, I see what you're getting at. You flop equity so often in PLO that it doesn't make sense to float someone unless I have some equity to fall back on. What else do I need to know about hand values to wreck these dudes at my table? Oh man, I love how you're thinking ahead. Pairing hand values with opponent tendencies gives us an infinite amount of situations to go over. And unfortunately, I live a pretty fast lifestyle, which means I don't have infinity to explain each one individually for you. What I can give you is a pretty easy rule of thumb, which is that instead of floating, you generally want to semi-bluff raise strong draws on the flop. But on the other hand, you should either float or toss your weaker draws into the muck on the flop. This depends somewhat on the actual strength of your draw and the number and types of opponents in the hand, but generally bluff raising strong draws is better because, well, first of all, remember that draws are still just draws, which doesn't guarantee that you'll win the hand. And given that the majority of hands on any flop can have up to 40% equity, even on scary boards, means that getting someone to fold away whatever equity they have is a good result. Secondly, if you do in fact have a very strong draw, like a pair plus a wrap, or a pair in the nut flush draw, slowing down by just calling in position can get an opponent to check fold scary turns with hands that they otherwise would have stuck their stack in with on the flop. On the other hand, floating with weak draws makes sense because we can gain more information on later streets by smooth calling. If they continue to barrel, then we can just fold, but if they check, we might get an opportunity to take it away. But bluff raising the flop can be pretty expensive, particularly if we get called and have no equity. Even when we're in position, playing big pots on later streets on scary boards can be very awkward if we don't have any equity to fall back on. Simply put, the weaker your draw is, the more opponent-dependent your decisions become. The presence of backdoor equity can turn a spot that would otherwise be unprofitable to float into a very profitable one. Consider the example you see here, where we hold ace-king-queen-5 on a 10-5 deuce rainbow board. At first glance, it looks like all we have is middle pair with some side cards, which by itself might be enough to justify a float. But if you look a little closer, the combination of overcards, backdoor flush draws, and backdoor straight draws provides us with more than enough turn cards to make a good decision on. If the turn brings a monster draw and our opponent fires pot, we can call with some implied odds and see if we get there. If the turn is a brick and he checks, we can stab at the pot and try to take it away. If we pick up some equity and he takes a weak stab, we can semi-bluff raise and take it down that way as well. You feel me on this? All right, let's move on. The last piece of the floating puzzle that we're going to cover has to do with the spots where we're floating out of position, and it makes sense. Now, floating out of position generally isn't a line that I or any others take very often, but there's certainly a few spots where you can take down the pot if you use it correctly. But for the most part, good opportunities to float out of position arise naturally. And what I mean is that you don't want to fall into the habit of doing it just for the sake of looking cool, which I've seen a lot of students do in the past once they know it exists. The best out of position floating opportunities come around when you have a strong read on your opponent, but without a strong read, it's generally a bad idea to float out of position. Because if you call a pot-sized bet on the flop with the intention of betting pot on the turn, that means that you're risking 4 bets to win 2, which means that your out of position float has to work 2/3 of the time to be profitable. And yeah, you guessed it, floating out of position with equity is infinitely better than doing it, without any equity. To be successful without any equity requires a very strong read on your opponents. But if you have some equity, you at least have an escape hatch to save your ass when you make a bad read. In short, being out of position with no equity on later streets is negative EV. Alright, here's the first hand we've got here. Folds around to the small blind. He min opens. We call with King 10, 6-4 single suited. I think it's pretty standard. You're getting a great price facing a min open. Perhaps I might fold it sometimes if he pot sized opened it, but even then, I think I can find a call and play it profitably. This guy's really not that great of a player, to be honest. So raised pots in position is where the profit is made. And, frankly, in blind versus blind situations, we talked about floating in the slides. Blind versus blind situations are where you're going to see a lot of floating. And in general, single raised pots, single raised heads up pots are where the most floating occurs. So, and for good reason. If you call in position on the flop, force the other player to play 3 streets against you, there's a lot of good reasons for floating in single raised pots. So he min opens and we call. Flops Queen Jack 3 rainbow. We've got an open ender, I guess a backdoor straight draw, and a backdoor flush draw. Our opponent bets about 3/4 pot, and we call. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this hand, or why I included this hand, is for a couple of reasons. One, I guess, is to highlight the reasons for floating and the reasons for bluff raising, and how to kind of distribute your frequencies here. So this is a board where you kind of want to be peeling a lot in general when facing c-bets. There's situations where, if I had nothing, let's say that I had 4, 4, 5, 5 somehow, I'd probably just folded the c-bet. But if you actually have something like some kind of piece of realizable equity, you really don't want to give up on these boards too much. And it's really just a matter of if you want to bluff raise or if you want to call. There's a couple of reasons why floating is better. Number one is I think that by calling we can represent a much wider range of hands, which is good for us. You want to think about the number of runouts where you can take it away. So if we're going to call here on this flop, we could call with really any pair and side cards, any pair and a gutter. We might have some slow plays in our range, but it's more about what your perceived range is. So, I wouldn't really want to raise. My raising range on this flop would be my continuing range on this flop is mostly by calling. But if I was to raise, it would be pretty polarized, right? I would mostly want a hand that I could get it in with, or that I could at least call a 3-bet with on the flop. So, maybe sometimes I would raise here with ace, king, queen 10, or an ace, king, 10, 9 type hand, a hand that can actually play for stacks. Otherwise, a bluff raise is kind of expensive. If you were to make it pot, you could make it about 49, and that's a pretty expensive raise. Without any piece of equity, you better be right most of the time. The thing that's nice about just floating is that we're going to get more information on the turn, and we're going to get a pretty good price on a steal if he checks it to us. So it's good in that way. Turns a queen, and our opponent bets again. And against some tighter players, I think that you can argue for a fold, or like if you are playing an unknown opponent, it might not be a bad spot for a fold too. But there's a few factors at work here. One is that he min opened pre, and I think that in general min opens are weaker. So I think that his range is wider. Second being, like, we know he's always going to see bet this flop, so his range is still pretty wide. Third being, it's a good barrel card for him. So if you're playing somebody who's competent and you know what level they're on, it's important to recognize that your opponent recognizes this as a good barrel card. So you know that his range is still going to be pretty wide. Again, like if we were playing some extremely tight player and maybe he like used a different bet sizing or something, or we had a bet sizing till, like, you can find a fold here. But I think that it's important to fight back in these kind of spots. And the thing that's nice is we can credibly represent a queen. We would certainly peel the flop with top pair and side cards. Just like, we peeled with something this week. But yeah, I mean, I also think that given how strong we look, calling the flop and then calling on this turn texture, we're going to find him check folding a lot of rivers when he doesn't have anything. So what we're relying on here is both, some player reads, some board texture identification, and a little bit of foresight, which, put those all together, makes for a plus EV call. So he bets the turn. Our opponent checks. No need to bet bigger than what we did here. Just big enough to where it's believable as a value bet. We would bet this much with trips. And, there's no reason to bomb it. Like, he's either going to call or not, right? He might dial us some of the time with, if he does happen to have like aces or kings. But I think that given our reads, I think that this was a pretty good spot to float, and I think that we ended up playing it pretty well, and we do get a fold. All right, we've got another hand here where it folds to the small blind. He opens for pot. We call in position. Seems pretty fine so far. Jack 10-8-6 with a suit. Yeah, we're in position. Nice, smooth hand that has some straight making possibilities. If you find yourself folding this, you're playing too tight, in my opinion. Flops 10-7-7, two-tone. So we basically have top pair and a non-nut gutter. Our opponent bets 16-80, and we decide to call. Again, so I think a lot of people think that floating is... They kind of picture floating as something you do when you don't have anything. But in PLO, you have something a lot of the time. And a lot of where profit is made in PLO is kind of turning made hands into bluffs. And I guess a better way to put it is to notice when your nothing is actually something, or your something is nothing. Or, when your something isn't really worth anything. And here I think that, although, like, if the action were to stop, let's say that there were, we only had one round of betting, he and I, we were playing live, and he bet, and I was like, all right, well, I'm going to call you, and there's no more action. Then, of course, this is almost certainly a plus, this is almost certainly a good call. But I think that, almost always there's going to be more action. So it's important to plan ahead to, on later streets, what you're going to do. So the call is fine, of course. In some instances, I would raise, but I think that in general, I'm not really planning on banking on my pair of tens being good here. I'm more so looking at the value of this hand as coming from having a 10 blocker and turning it into a bluff on later streets. And this is kind of the nice thing when the SPR is a little bit higher. We're going to have some room to leverage on later streets and put our opponents in a tough spot, either when he checks and we bet twice, or he bets and we raise, which is kind of what happens here. He bets 40 and we make it 112. So a couple of things to point out here. One is It's important to have some reads on your opponent, right? This guy seems pretty aggressive overall. This is a good spot for him to fire a second barrel with whatever he has. Like he could have some like a variety of different combo draws, like straight draws and flush draws. He could have an overpair and he's just betting for protection. I mean, he could have trip sevens, to be completely honest. But the fact of the matter is that I've got a lot of things going for me here. One is the 10 blocker, which reduces the odds that he actually has a boat. Like, if he has just naked trips here, he can't really just stick it in for the most part. Not to mention, like, I'm taking a pretty credible line. I look believable. Third being, look at how I'm leveraging my stack. It's kind of putting him to a decision for like all of my or my entire stack, while I'm only risking 112, which is nice. It's most of the time I think when people make a leveraged raise like this, especially when it's short-handed, it's like mid-stakes. Most of the time you're going to see people follow through on the river, so he's kind of got to think about if he does decide to peel one off with an overpair or whatever else he has, that the threat of a future bet is a big deal. So it's nice in that way. And, there's an argument for like calling the turn and then like betting when check two on the river, right? That is an argument, of course, but I think that raising the turn is better, and I'll tell you why. First being, this guy seems pretty aggressive. So typically against people who are aggressive barrelers, it's better to raise early on in the hand if you do plan on bluffing, because otherwise you're going to risk more by like jamming on a later street, or he might just check the river and then now he can just like bluff catch you in a smaller pot, and you don't get to leverage as much as you had the opportunity to. Second, like as I mentioned, you don't want to just like be calling barrels with nothing. So I would be more prone to just like call a turn barrel here if I actually had the nuts. Not to say that I would never raise the turn if I had the nuts, but I certainly would be more prone to do so if I have the nuts. So our opponent calls, and although we're beat here sometimes, I do think that he will bluff caught us enough on the turn to have like overpairs and, like I said, like other random draws that kind of bricked out. And I'd prefer to just turn our hand into a bluff, which I do, then just check it back. Although we might be good sometimes. I think that most of the time we will not be good. So it's better to just turn our hand into a bluff. And we win the pot. So there's another good floating spot. But again, like the main reason I included this one is talking about having some foresight, or some multi-street planning. The float is powerful on the flop because we have the blocker, because of course we have like the gut shot. But it's also important to realize who your opponent is and be kind of committed to the bluff when the spot presents itself. All right, this hand will wrap up the video, but it's a good spot, and I thought we would talk about it. So let's do it. Buttonman opens, and he seems, I don't know, pretty aggressive so far, I guess, but he's like a little less than half stacking, so he could be bad. I think most players who are just kind of randomly half stacking at this level are probably not great. And with his stats, I would say he's not like just spewing around crazy, but maybe he's just like a bum hunter, or he's like a new player at these stakes or something like that. So anyhow, we call from the big blind with 10-9-8-4 double suited. Pretty standard so far. Some people will 3-bet this. I think that that's okay too. But really the only mistake would be just outright folding it. I prefer calling with these kind of trashier double suited hands. Of course, if it was like 10-9-8-6 or like Jack 10-9-7 double suited, I almost always 3-bet. But with the 4 dangler, and it's not quite as strong of a hand, and I'd prefer to just play a small pot, especially against someone who I don't really have a ton of reads on right now. I think it's fine to take the low variance line against unknowns. So the flop becomes ace 9-3 rainbow. we have middle pair, backdoor straight draw, 2 backdoor flush draws. We check, our opponent bets 6 into 9, and we decide to call. Now in the slides, we talked a little bit about reverse floating, and I think this is a pretty good spot for it. You know, in the previous video where I talked about check raising lightly, this was one of the board textures that I said, board textures and hand values that I said were good for check raising. And it actually is in a lot of cases, but there's a couple of reasons why here I think that reverse floating is a better option. One being is stack sizes, right? This guy's pretty short. If he does happen to have an ace, which he will have some of the time, he could just stick in an ace, and we wouldn't get to realize our backdoor equity, which actually is worth a lot on this board, I think. Second being, I think that by check calling, our perceived range looks pretty strong. You know, we can get credit for an ace, and someone who is this short probably won't just, you know, barrel off with nothing. So it's one of those situations, again, we talked a little bit in the other hand histories about having some foresight, having some multi-street planning, where thinking ahead can be worth a lot and can help you win the hand. Like, my plan was here, if on some turns I would lead, like maybe if I picked up a really strong draw, like if the turn was the 7 of spades, maybe I would lead, maybe I would check raise all in, maybe I would just check call depending on his bet sizing. But, you know, if he checks back the turn, we can really comfortably lead the river and expect a lot of folds unless he just rivers a 2 pair, or maybe he like backdoors a set somehow. I don't know. But the point being is that these are good boards to reverse float on. So if you remember from the slides, the main items to focus on when you're picking floating, when you're deciding whether to float or not, both in position and out of position, are board texture and c-betting frequency. So this is a board where people are going to be c-betting a lot, but they won't have much on very often. So this is a pretty good board for it. You know, if you're a little deeper, you can get away with a check raise. But even a little bit deeper, if people are really only firing one with bluffs, then it's actually more profitable to just peel one off and then lead rivers when they check back the turn, which is what happens here. You know, it goes check, check, get a good lead the river. You know, for a good balanced amount, we can lead here when we have a value bet size. We're getting a good price in our bluff as it stands. And unless he's got 2 pair plus, it's pretty damn hard for him to call. So I think I think we played the hand well. And he folds. So that's going to conclude our lesson for today. We brought up a lot of good points about floating. Floating is very, very powerful in PLO, especially in a game, you know, where you're dealt 4 cards. You can represent almost anything on any run out if you have the right preflop ranges. And as always, looking forward to see your guys' comments in the forums. And let me know what else you would like me to cover in the future. Take care, guys. Good luck and happy holidays.